For me, I think that being undisciplined is really about being creative, about being willing to color outside the lines, so to speak, and about really exploring, creative, novel approaches in what I do. While many of my colleagues in anthropology, not here at York University, but sort of in the larger field of Canadian and American anthropology, seem quite invested in having these really clear boundaries around what is anthropology, what it is we do, how do we do it. And for me, those boundaries are not very important. In fact, I really like to think of myself as an anti-disciplinary scholar. And so for me, being undisciplined is also, to refer to trying to break down these disciplinary borders or boundaries. And this project actually really emerges from my own personal experience. So while I was a postdoc in Kenya, I ended up with a brain injury. And I sensed a real gap between my own experience of what it was like to live with this brain injury and how neurologists and other clinicians were understanding brain injuries. And so I decided to use my own experience as a sort of point of departure to think more about brain injuries. Brain injuries are embodied, they are felt, they're sort of everyday, and they manifest themselves in all kinds of different ways. And generally we think about those as being really pathologizing, or we talk about neurological disorders, but a lot of it is sort of interesting and productive. So there are good things that came from my brain injury. And so I wanted to sort of rethink how we thought about that. And I wanted to pay attention to that type of evidence. So the embodied, the felt experience of people who have brain injuries, as opposed to the clinical or the neuroscientific evidence, which is usually from postmortems or CT and MRI scans. So those types of evidence don't actually speak to the lived, embodied, felt experience of people who have brain injuries. And so I thought, okay, well, what can an ethnography do differently? How could an ethnographic approach to traumatic brain injuries actually augment what it is clinicians know about brain injury? So I've been playing with things like sound and stills and using medical records and using performance as a way to convey some of that invisible, more embodied evidence that I think ethnography is very good at getting at. So at the Center for Imaginative Ethnography, what we call the CIE, was one of those things that emerged from, I guess, hallway conversations. So there are a group of us who are really interested in experimental ethnography, so non-conventional ways of doing anthropology, but also of representing. So it meant like how we collect data in the field, but also how we share, or, through dissemination. And so we were interested in doing non-text-based, non-traditional ethnographic fieldwork. And we decided to, really create this research collective that was meant to foster and support experimental or imaginative ethnography. And so that was showcasing work that included film and sound and photographs, whether they're stills or moving images. We edited a book that was an undergraduate and graduate teaching book around these sort of experimental methods with the University of Toronto Press a couple of years ago. But that edited book really sort of maps out these sort of experimental ethnographic methods for teaching anthropology classes. If I can enlighten and change ideas of students and they go on to do great things, and that's the best way we can make an impact, for me anyways.